It's a sharp line, but when you look at the way Christianity was built, it's hard not to see how closely it matches the definition of a death cult. You don't have to go to some obscure group on the fringes of society to find the traits we usually associate with dangerous cults. You can find every single one of them right in the faith that so many people were raised inside. The core obsession of Christianity is death, the death of its leader, the death of its followers, and the promise of something after death that makes this life feel secondary. From the very beginning, believers are taught that life on earth is broken, dirty, temporary. The real prize comes only when you stop breathing. And what makes it even more striking is how normalized this outlook is. People don't realize that they are being told, over and over, that the ultimate goal is to leave this life behind. One of the clearest signs of a death cult is fixation on sacrifice. In Christianity, the central story is that the Son of God had to be brutally executed to wash away the guilt of everyone else. Without blood, there is no forgiveness. Without a killing, there is no cleansing. Think about that. In a healthy worldview, life is what you protect. In this one, death is what gives life meaning. And it doesn't stop there. Every ritual reinforces this point. Communion is literally the symbolic eating of a body and drinking of blood. Week after week, millions of people reenact a ritual that, outside the walls of a church, would be called cannibalistic. Yet inside, it's celebrated as the highest expression of devotion. That's not an accident. That's the mechanics of a cult keeping death at the center. Another trait of death cults is how they reframe suffering as a virtue. Christianity glorifies martyrdom. It teaches that the greatest heroes are the ones who died for the cause. The saints aren't remembered for how much joy they created in life, but for how much pain they endured before death. Pain becomes a badge of honor. The more you suffer, the closer you are to God. It's the exact same psychological trick cults have used across history. Turn misery into proof of loyalty. And when you grow up in it, you don't question this. You don't notice that you're being taught to celebrate death, to distrust your own instincts, to reject the natural drive to survive and thrive in this world. It's just normal. That's what makes it so effective. The system even discourages people from asking hard questions. If you push back, you're told you're weak in faith. If you struggle with the idea that death should be celebrated, you're made to feel guilty, as if the problem is with you and not the teaching. That's another hallmark of cult psychology. Doubt isn't allowed to live out in the open. It has to be smothered before it grows. The promise of reward after death also creates a built-in control mechanism. Leaders don't have to pay people in this life. They don't have to solve real problems or make life better. They can promise eternal riches that no one can verify, and followers will devote their entire lives chasing it. That's not just clever, it's manipulative at the deepest level. When you stack these traits together, obsession with death, ritualized fixation on blood and sacrifice, glorification of suffering, suppression of doubt, and the dangling promise of a better world after you're gone, you're looking at a system that checks every single box of a death cult. The difference is that this one grew big enough, powerful enough, to be called a world religion. But power doesn't change the core, it only hides it. And if you were raised in it, you know how deeply it works its way into your thinking. The songs, the prayers, the funerals, the constant reminders that your real home is not here but somewhere else. It's not just doctrine, it becomes the lens through which people see everything. Life is just a waiting room. Death is the door. That mindset shapes how people live every day. When you're taught that this life is just a test, you start to devalue the only world you actually have. You don't fight as hard for justice, because the real justice is supposed to come later. You don't invest fully in solving problems here, because heaven is waiting with perfect answers. Entire generations grow up with their eyes fixed on an afterlife instead of on the real lives unfolding around them. And that's where you see the darker consequences. If people believe suffering here doesn't matter because paradise is coming, then suffering becomes tolerable. Poverty, injustice, violence, inequality, all of it can be shrugged off with the idea that this world is temporary. That's the kind of thinking that allows cruel systems to survive. Because if believers are told not to expect fairness here, they won't demand it. They'll see their misery as part of the plan. Death cults also thrive by splitting the world into insiders and outsiders. Christianity does this in its own way. Believers are promised eternal life. Outsiders face eternal punishment. The line is sharp and the fear is heavy. This isn't just about community. It's about dividing people into those who are saved and those who are doomed. That fear of being left out, of being cast into eternal torment, keeps people locked inside the system. Psychologists who study high control groups often point out that fear of leaving is just as important as love of belonging. In Christianity, the fear couldn't be higher. Eternal hell, eternal separation, eternal punishment. That's the ultimate threat, and it's dangled constantly. Even people who stop believing often carry the fear with them for years. That's not accidental. That's conditioning. Think about how children are brought into it. They don't get to choose. From the time they can walk, they're told stories of crucifixion, of punishment, of blood sacrifice. They're told that if they don't believe the right way, they could be punished forever. For a young mind, that's terrifying. It wires fear deep into the brain. That's the kind of early imprinting cults rely on. Get them before they can think for themselves. Even the language around death is softened to keep it appealing. Funerals aren't about grief, they're about celebrating life and going home. Death isn't called death, it's called being called to glory or resting with the Lord. It's reframed as the best possible outcome. That's how you keep people from rebelling against the horror of it. You take the sting out by turning it into victory. Another pattern that shows up is obedience. In many cults, loyalty to the leader is measured by willingness to suffer or die. In Christianity, loyalty is measured by willingness to surrender your own desires, your own thinking, even your own family ties. The Gospels record Jesus saying things like, "Anyone who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me." That's classic cult control. Your loyalty to the group must outweigh your loyalty to blood relatives. When you step back, the picture becomes clearer. Christianity doesn't just tolerate death, it glorifies it. It takes the most natural fear humans have, the fear of dying, and transforms it into the central selling point. Instead of fearing death, you're told to long for it, to see it as the beginning of something better. And once you flip that switch in someone's mind, you can get them to do almost anything. The history of the faith shows this power over and over. Martyrdom in the Roman Empire, crusaders marching to war under the promise of paradise, missionaries risking everything because they believed death was just the gateway to reward. All of it only makes sense when you realize death had been turned into the currency of the entire system. And even today, in less dramatic ways, you see how the same logic plays out. How many sermons tell people not to fear illness, because death is just the start of eternal life? How many prayers at hospital bedsides frame death as release instead of loss? It seeps into the culture so deeply that people forget how strange it is. In any other context, wishing for death would be alarming. In this one, it's considered holy. When you look at how this shapes communities, the results are profound. Whole towns organize their lives around rituals that reinforce death at the center. Sunday after Sunday, people gather to sing about the blood, the cross, the sacrifice. They raise children on hymns that glorify suffering. And because it's wrapped in music, ritual, and repetition, it doesn't feel sinister. It feels comforting. But comfort doesn't erase what's actually being celebrated. This comfort is what keeps people from noticing the cult-like structure. The songs are soothing. The buildings are beautiful. The sermons are delivered in calm voices. But underneath all that, the core message is the same one you'd hear in any high control group: submit, obey, and prepare to die. Only in this case, the command is hidden under a thin layer of warmth and community. Another trait of cults is the way they isolate people from outside influence. Christianity doesn't always do this by cutting members off physically, but it does so mentally. You're told not to conform to the world. You're warned against secular ideas. You're told that non-believers are lost, broken, or even dangerous. The result is the same as physical isolation. The group becomes your only source of truth. And because the whole system is built on fear of hell, the stakes feel infinite. It's not like walking away from a club or even leaving a family. In the believer's mind, walking away means risking eternal torture. That's not freedom of choice. That's coercion. That's psychological imprisonment. Sociologists talk about bounded choice. The idea that even when people seem free to choose, their choices are shaped by heavy pressure and fear. Christianity is a textbook case. On paper, you're free to leave. In practice, you've been trained since childhood that leaving could mean everlasting suffering. What kind of choice is that? And this doesn't just affect the individual, it shapes entire societies. Cultures steeped in this thinking often struggle to embrace progress, because progress requires valuing life here and now. If the main focus is on preparing for death, why worry about climate change, poverty, or education? Why fight to fix systems when the world itself is seen as doomed? This death-centered mindset even bleeds into politics. Leaders who share the faith can justify wars, environmental neglect, and social inequality by framing this life as temporary. If you think the world is ending soon, why care about long-term solutions? If you think paradise is guaranteed after death, why fight to make this life fair? The ripple effects are enormous, and they're not accidental. They're baked into the theology itself. Another under-discussed angle is how the obsession with death impacts mental health. When children grow up being told that life is fallen, corrupt, and fleeting, it plants seeds of despair. Studies have shown that religious environments obsessed with sin and punishment can increase anxiety, depression, and guilt. People often internalize the idea that they are broken by default, and only death will fix them. That's not just bad theology, it's psychological harm dressed up as spirituality. You can see it in the way guilt and shame are used as tools. You're told that your body, your desires, your instincts are sinful, and the only cure is the blood of someone who died. That's not an uplifting worldview. That's a system designed to make you feel dependent, to convince you that your very humanity is flawed, and the only hope is to embrace the cult's narrative of death and redemption. And once you're locked into that dependency, it's incredibly hard to leave. Even people who intellectually walk away often carry the fear and guilt for years. The conditioning doesn't vanish overnight. It lingers in the subconscious, whispering doubts, raising fears late at night, especially when death feels near. That's the mark of a system that drilled itself deep into the mind. What makes all of this even more powerful is how invisible it becomes once it's normalized. When everyone around you believes the same thing, it doesn't feel like a cult. It feels like reality. You don't notice the strange rituals because they're weekly habits. You don't notice the glorification of death because it's wrapped in love songs. You don't notice the manipulation because it's spoken in gentle tones. But when you peel back the layers, the structure is there. Death as the central obsession, fear as the control mechanism, isolation through mistrust of outsiders, suppression of doubt, elevation of suffering as holy, promises of reward that can't be verified until after you die. Every single element matches the checklist of a death cult. One of the strongest signs that Christianity functions like a death cult is the way it flips natural instincts upside down. Humans are wired to survive, to avoid harm, to protect loved ones. But in this framework, those instincts are often labeled as weakness. To cling to life is seen as selfish. To desire comfort is called sinful. To love family more than the faith is framed as betrayal. The natural drive to live fully in this world is constantly shamed and redirected toward the next. You can see this in the way believers are taught to view illness and tragedy. Instead of fighting with everything they have to hold on to life, they're often told to accept suffering as part of God's plan. They're reminded that heaven is waiting, that death is not the end. The urgency to preserve life here is blunted by the promise of something better beyond. That's exactly how a death cult keeps its members from resisting. It teaches them not to fight against the one thing the cult ultimately glorifies, death itself. And while this outlook is presented as comforting, it has destructive consequences. It can lead to neglect in healthcare, because prayer is seen as more powerful than medicine. It can lead to indifference toward disasters, because this life is temporary anyway. It can lead to communities rallying around acceptance instead of change, even when the change could save lives. History gives us stark examples. During plagues in Europe, Christian leaders sometimes encourage people to embrace the suffering as purification, rather than focus on prevention. During wars, soldiers were told that dying in battle was a form of sacrifice rewarded by eternal life. Even today, missionaries sometimes enter dangerous situations, believing their death would glorify God. These are not outliers, they're consistent with the underlying death-centered logic of the faith. And it's not just about physical death. The system encourages a kind of psychological death long before the body stops working. Followers are told to die to self, to kill their desires, their ambitions, their individuality. The idea of self-sacrifice is expanded until it covers every aspect of being human. In the end, you're not only preparing for your physical death, you're rehearsing it daily by giving up pieces of yourself. That constant rehearsal of death is what binds the believer more tightly to the group. If you've already trained yourself to think of your instincts as sinful, your body as corrupt, and your mind as untrustworthy, then you have no ground left to stand on. The only anchor you're offered is the very system that stripped your foundation in the first place. That's control at its deepest level. And here's the thing that's often missed. When outsiders hear the word death cult, they picture small, secretive groups, often ending in mass tragedy. But the psychology doesn't change just because the numbers get bigger. In fact, the only reason Christianity doesn't look like a fringe cult is because it succeeded. It grew large enough to shape laws, culture, and entire civilizations. But size doesn't erase the structure. It only hides it in plain sight. When a cult gains power, its practices stop looking strange because they become normal. The rituals are no longer odd. They're sacred. The rules are no longer controlling. They're moral. The obsession with death is no longer alarming. It's holy. That's how something that checks every box of a death cult can flourish for centuries without most people ever recognizing it for what it is. And if you were raised in it, that normalization runs deep. The songs, the holidays, the prayers at the dinner table, they all weave death-centered language into daily life. You don't even notice how often you hear about blood, sacrifice, or eternal reward. It's just background noise. But background noise can still shape the way you think. It can still form the walls of a cage, even if the cage is decorated with stained glass and candlelight. The irony is that Christianity often points to other groups and warns about cults. It teaches its followers to be suspicious of small sects with strict leaders, unusual rituals, and fear-based control. But when you strip away the branding, the very same tactics are being used inside its own walls. The only difference is scale and respectability. Another key part of how a death cult holds power is through repetition. Messages about death, sacrifice, and eternal reward aren't delivered once or twice. They're repeated endlessly. Weekly sermons, daily prayers, seasonal holidays, funeral rites, wedding vows, even the way people speak casually to each other, all of it circles back to the same idea. This life doesn't matter as much as what comes after. Repetition is one of the most basic tools of conditioning. Psychologists have long known that if you hear something enough times, it starts to feel true, even if it isn't. In Christianity, children grow up hearing phrases like, "Jesus died for you," "Life is a vapor," "The wages of sin is death," and "This world is not our home," over and over, until it settles deep into their subconscious. By the time they're old enough to question it, it already feels like reality, not doctrine. And this creates a self-sustaining cycle. Each generation passes it on to the next, convinced they're offering comfort, not realizing they're also passing down fear. A parent who believes death is the gateway to eternal joy will tell their children the same story, thinking it's a gift. But in reality, it's a framework that can quietly warp how they see life, how they face challenges, how they process loss. One of the most underdiscussed consequences of this worldview is how it shapes grief. In a healthy culture, grief is accepted as a natural response to losing someone. It's an expression of love. But in Christian settings, grief is often shortened or silenced with phrases like, "they're in a better place," or "we'll see them again." The natural process of mourning is interrupted by the demand to conform to the cult's view of death. Instead of allowing pain to be expressed, it's reframed as a lack of faith. This not only stifles emotional honesty, it also distances people from their own feelings. If you can't grieve fully, you can't heal fully. If you're pressured to mask sorrow with forced hope, you carry unprocessed pain that never goes away. Over time, that erodes mental health. Yet the culture around it calls that erosion faith and praises it. Another psychological angle is how death obsession provides leaders with unshakable authority. If a preacher convinces you that he holds the key to life after death, his power is total. No politician, no boss, no teacher can compete with the claim of controlling eternity. That's why so many religious leaders have been able to manipulate followers into giving money, labor, loyalty, and even their lives. Once you've tied your identity to someone who claims to hold the afterlife in their hands, it's nearly impossible to say no to them. And history shows how this authority has been abused again and again. From indulgences in medieval Europe, where people paid for shorter time in purgatory, to modern televangelists promising healing and salvation in exchange for donations. The same mechanism is at work. Exploit the fear of death, sell the promise of life after it, and people will hand over everything. But there's another dimension worth pointing out. Christianity not only normalizes death, it makes believers complicit in celebrating it. Every time someone sings about the cross, they're glorifying an execution. Every communion service is a symbolic act of drinking blood. Every Easter is a celebration of a gruesome death being framed as victory. These rituals don't just remind people of doctrine, they train people to find joy in the imagery of suffering and death. And once death is reframed as good, you can convince people to accept almost any atrocity. That's why, throughout history, leaders could justify wars, crusades, inquisitions, and executions under the banner of faith. If death is holy, then killing for the cause becomes justifiable. If death leads to eternal reward, then soldiers dying in battle are framed as martyrs. The cult logic scales up from the individual to entire nations. Even in modern culture, you still see how this logic plays out. Politicians who invoke Christianity often frame deadly policies, wars, neglect of healthcare, resistance to safety measures, as acceptable because death isn't the end. They rarely say it outright, but the underlying assumption is clear. This world matters less than the next, and that gives them cover to ignore suffering in the here and now. This is how something that started as a small apocalyptic movement in the ancient world has grown into a system that still shapes lives today. It's not just belief in God that keeps people loyal. It's the death-centered narrative, repeated endlessly, wrapped in ritual, normalized through culture, and enforced by fear. If you trace Christianity back to its roots, the death obsession is built into its DNA. The earliest communities weren't focused on building lasting societies or long-term cultures. They were focused on the end of the world. The letters of Paul are filled with urgency, telling people that time was short, that the world was passing away. Followers weren't told to build, they were told to wait for the end. That apocalyptic outlook is classic death cult thinking. Everything here is disposable because something better is just around the corner. This helps explain why the early church could grow in such dangerous conditions. If you believe death is gain, then persecution loses its sting. If you think the world is about to end, then investing in farms, businesses, or political systems feels pointless. The entire foundation was short-term, otherworldly, and centered on leaving this life behind. Over the centuries, the apocalyptic edge softened, but it never disappeared. It still flares up in waves. Every generation produces preachers who claim the end is near, who warn of judgment just over the horizon. Entire movements, from medieval millennial sects to modern-day rapture believers, are fueled by this same current. It's the death cult logic resurfacing in cycles, each time convincing new followers that this life is only the prelude to a bigger finale. And even when apocalypse isn't the focus, the fixation on sacrifice and suffering remains. Think about monasteries, entire orders devoted to renouncing the world, embracing poverty, fasting, punishing the body. In many traditions, the more you reject life's pleasures, the holier you're seen to be. That's not an embrace of life. That's rehearsing death one small piece at a time. It's the same with missionary zeal. Crossing oceans, facing disease, even risking violent death was often framed as noble. The death of a missionary wasn't seen as tragedy, but as triumph. That mindset still lingers in some circles today. Stories of missionaries dying are held up as inspirational rather than cautionary. Again, that's the logic of a system where death itself is celebrated as proof of faith. And because these stories are told with reverence, the underlying message sinks deeper. People learn that the most meaningful lives are the ones cut short for the cause, that to embrace danger, even death, is the highest form of loyalty. That's how you take the most basic human fear, the fear of dying, and turn it into a tool of control. What's striking is how much of this passes unnoticed in modern culture. Look at Christian symbols. The most common is a cross, a device of execution. People wear it around their necks, hang it on their walls, even decorate churches with it. Imagine if any other group took a torture device and turned it into jewelry. It would look disturbing, but when you're raised inside it, the strangeness disappears. The same goes for language. Phrases like, washed in the blood, or the lamb that was slain, are repeated so often they lose their shock value. Yet, if you strip away the familiarity, they're gruesome. They're rooted in imagery of killing, bloodletting, and death as salvation. This isn't incidental, it's the very heart of the faith, and that heart still beats in subtle ways throughout society. In how funerals are framed, in how tragedy is explained, in how people are taught to endure injustice. Even outside of church walls, echoes of the death cult remain. They shape laws on end-of-life care, on reproductive rights, on war and peace. Decisions about real lives in the here and now are filtered through a lens that keeps insisting this life is temporary, less important, and secondary to what comes after. The danger is that once you accept this framework, it's easy to justify almost anything. Environmental destruction doesn't matter. The world is ending anyway. War casualties doesn't matter. They're going to a better place. Poverty and suffering doesn't matter. They'll be rewarded later. Every real problem in this world gets softened by pointing to the next. That's the hallmark of a death cult. Redirect attention from solving problems now to waiting for a promised future that never arrives. And if you grew up inside it, this logic is hard to escape. Even if you step away from the faith, the habits of thought linger. You may still find yourself brushing off pain with phrases you were taught as a child. You may still feel guilty for enjoying life fully, as if joy is selfish. You may still feel fear at the thought of death, not because of death itself, but because of what you were told waits beyond it. That's the kind of psychological residue a death cult leaves behind. When you step back and look at Western culture, the influence of this death-focused mindset is everywhere. Laws, customs, and moral codes all carry echoes of a system that glorifies suffering, prioritizes the afterlife, and keeps people in line through fear of punishment. Even concepts we take for granted, like humility, self-denial, and delayed gratification, can be traced back to this framework. They aren't inherently bad, but in context, they reinforce the same death-centered obedience that defines a cult. Take morality, for instance. Many people believe they are making ethical choices out of compassion or justice. But in a culture steeped in Christian thinking, morality is often framed in terms of reward and punishment beyond death. You're good because you'll be saved. You avoid wrong because you'll be punished. That's not intrinsic ethical reasoning. That's extrinsic compliance. It's the same mechanism cults use to control behavior. Even education was shaped by this mindset for centuries. Universities grew out of church institutions. Study was valued not for discovery or critical thinking, but for interpreting sacred texts and training clergy. Knowledge itself was often subordinated to theology. And though modern schools have largely broken free, the cultural residue remains. Respect for authority, fear of questioning core beliefs, reverence for tradition over inquiry, all subtle ways a death-first worldview can persist. You can also see it in law and governance. Western legal codes were historically influenced by the idea that sin and punishment matter more than immediate human welfare. The justice system in some societies emphasized penance, suffering, and redemption more than rehabilitation or protection. In many ways, the law became a mechanism to enforce moral control in a society conditioned to value obedience over independent judgment. And that conditioning often extended to how society treated death itself. Funerals, cemeteries, and memorials are not just practical. They are rituals that reinforce the same cult logic. People dress in black, mourn in prescribed ways, recite prayers, and internalize the idea that death is a gateway to reward. It's a constant, subtle reinforcement of the narrative that has held sway for millennia. Another cultural consequence is how power and leadership are justified. Kings, rulers, and even modern politicians often invoke divine sanction, implying that obedience to them mirrored obedience to God. That's classic cult strategy. By tying authority to an unseen, ultimate power, it becomes unchallengeable. And because the promise of afterlife reward is stronger than immediate consequence, followers accept hierarchies that might otherwise seem unjust. Even today, the death-first perspective quietly shapes behavior. Health decisions, economic choices, and social priorities are filtered through a lens that often values the next life over this one. Think of anti-vaccine rhetoric in some religious communities, or opposition to life-saving policies justified by fatalistic appeals to God's plan. Life here is secondary, death is glorified, and control is maintained. Psychologically, this worldview produces a paradox. It tells people to fear death, yet to revere it, to endure suffering without question, yet to trust it leads to reward, to submit control over their lives to a higher authority, yet see that submission as freedom. That tension is the hallmark of a death cult, teaching compliance through promises that are intangible, unprovable, and eternal. And if you were raised inside it, the imprint is subtle but profound. You learn that pleasure must be tempered, pain must be endured, and death is the ultimate triumph. You carry habits, language, and instincts that reinforce the system long after you leave the pews behind. Even modern secular society still feels the pull of these ideas because they are baked into our culture, law, and morality. When you step back and connect all the dots, the obsession with death, the glorification of suffering, the fear of eternal punishment, the rituals reinforcing these lessons, the suppression of doubt, and the control exerted over minds and communities, the picture is clear. Christianity, for all its size, history, and cultural prestige, exhibits every defining characteristic of a death cult. And that is the part most people never notice until they look closely. The symbols, the hymns, the sermons, the holidays, they're all normalized. The logic of death as virtue, fear as control, and suffering as a path to glory becomes invisible precisely because it's woven into every layer of life. It's only when you pull back, when you analyze the patterns, that the contours of the system emerge. What makes this framework so powerful is that it doesn't just sit in sermons or scriptures. It seeps into daily choices, shaping how people treat themselves, their families, and even strangers. A worldview that glorifies death doesn't stay confined to theology. It filters into healthcare, parenting, politics, and culture. Think about healthcare decisions. In communities where the afterlife is emphasized, there's often less urgency around preventative care. If death is framed as going home, then why fight to extend life? You see families turning down medical treatments, trusting instead that prayer will do the work. You see resistance to science because trusting doctors seems weaker than trusting God. And tragically, lives are cut short not because they had to be, but because death was quietly reframed as victory. Parenting is another area where the imprint shows. Children grow up being told not only that death is coming, but that they are personally guilty for it. The doctrine of original sin means a child is taught that their very existence is flawed, stained, and only redeemable through the death of another. That's a heavy psychological burden to carry before you even understand what death is. It's not just a story. It's identity-shaping conditioning. In politics, the death-first mindset has enormous influence. Policies around war, healthcare, poverty, and even climate change are often filtered through the belief that this world is temporary. If paradise is elsewhere, then there's no need to preserve the planet. If eternal reward awaits, then injustice now is tolerable. It's easier for leaders to excuse cruelty when their followers are already trained to see suffering and death as part of a divine plan. And this outlook doesn't just affect what people do, it affects how they feel. Death anxiety, the most basic human fear, is both stoked and soothed by the same system. People are told to fear eternal punishment, but also to long for eternal life. That double bind keeps them tethered. They can never fully relax because the stakes are infinite, but they can never fully rebel because the promise is irresistible. It's a psychological trap that works at every level. You see it most clearly in the way believers talk about life. They describe themselves as strangers in this world, as if they don't belong here. They're told their real home is somewhere else, beyond the grave. That mindset creates a quiet alienation from the only life they actually have. Instead of embracing the here and now, they learn to endure it, to wait it out, to treat life like a test rather than an opportunity. And that alienation has costs. When people see this world as a temporary stop, they invest less in making it better. They pour less into relationships, communities, and the environment. They look past injustice because they believe ultimate justice will come later. The death cult logic doesn't just distort the way individuals live. It weakens societies as a whole. What makes it especially insidious is how much of it feels comforting on the surface. Funerals framed as celebrations. Suffering reframed as noble. Sacrifice reframed as holy. It softens reality enough that people accept things they would otherwise resist. That's why it works. A cult doesn't just force compliance. It convinces you to embrace your own submission. And the submission here is total. Your body, your thoughts, your desires, your future, all surrendered to a system that tells you this life is not truly yours. It belongs to something else, and its worth will only be measured after you die. That's not just faith, that's control. History offers endless case studies of what happens when a culture is built around glorifying death. The Crusades are a clear example. Armies were told that dying in battle would guarantee paradise. With that belief, leaders could mobilize thousands to march into slaughter, convinced their deaths were not only acceptable, but holy. The fear of death was replaced by the thrill of reward, exactly how a death cult keeps people under control. The same pattern shows up in the Inquisition. Instead of valuing life, the system valued conformity at any cost. People were tortured and killed in the name of saving their souls. The twisted logic was that death by fire here was better than eternal fire later. It's an idea only possible inside a worldview that sees death as the lesser of two evils, a kind of medicine for the soul. Even beyond Europe, the same mindset shaped colonization. Missionaries and conquerors often framed death, whether their own or that of others, as a necessary step toward spreading the faith. Entire civilizations were devastated, with violence justified as a pathway to salvation. That's not just politics or greed at work, it's death-first theology weaponized. And this isn't only about history. You can see the same mentality today in smaller, more personal ways. Think of families who refuse blood transfusions or medical care because they trust God to decide. Think of pastors who tell grieving parents that their child's death was part of the plan. Think of communities that gather after tragedies to say, almost by reflex, God needed another angel. All of these responses may sound compassionate, but they reinforce the same idea. Death is not something to resist. It's something to accept. This acceptance can dull outrage. When natural disasters strike, believers often frame them as signs of the end times, or as mysterious parts of God's will. Instead of demanding answers, instead of pushing for better systems to protect people, they retreat into resignation. A cult doesn't just teach its members how to die. It teaches them not to demand life. And when you look at modern politics, the same themes repeat. Leaders who oppose social safety, nets, healthcare reform, or environmental protections often draw support from religious voters who believe this world is temporary. It's easier to neglect the poor, the sick, and the planet itself when the culture has been conditioned to see suffering as holy and death as reward. The psychological toll is immense. People raised in this framework often describe struggling with guilt for feeling too attached to life. They've been told since childhood that loving this world too much is a sign of weakness. That joy here is dangerous because it might distract from eternity. Some carry a quiet shame for being afraid of death, as if fear itself is a failure of faith. That's not spiritual comfort. That's psychological trauma disguised as devotion. And when doubt does creep in, the cult framework has a built-in defense. Any questioning is labeled as rebellion. Any fear is framed as lack of faith. The system turns your natural instincts against you, convincing you that the problem isn't with the doctrine, but with yourself. That's how control is maintained, not by open force, but by training people to police their own thoughts. When you add all this up, the history of violence justified by theology, the personal tragedies excused by faith, the cultural resignation to suffering, and the mental scars carried by generations. It becomes harder to ignore the reality. This is not just a religion with a few grim symbols. It is a system that has normalized death, weaponized suffering, and built an entire worldview on the promise of life only after life ends. What's remarkable is how deeply this death-centered logic has soaked into culture, even outside of church walls. You can see it in art, where some of the most celebrated works depict crucifixions, martyrs, and scenes of suffering. For centuries, Western painting and sculpture were obsessed with portraying bodies in agony, saints in torment, Christ on the cross. Death wasn't just a theme, it was the ultimate subject, and viewers were trained to see beauty in that suffering, to admire the devotion behind the pain. Music followed the same pattern. Hymns, oratorios, and choral works revolve endlessly around sacrifice, blood, and longing for the afterlife. Generations have grown up singing words that glorify death without stopping to ask why. The melodies are stirring, the harmonies uplifting, but the core message is still the same. Life is broken, death is the goal, eternity is what matters. The beauty of the art hides the bleakness of the message. Even in everyday language, you can hear the echoes. Phrases like "gone to a better place," "rest in peace," or "called home" are so common they feel natural. But each one reflects a worldview that reframes death not as loss, but as transition. People who don't even consider themselves religious still repeat these lines at funerals because they're so deeply ingrained in the culture. The death cult logic spreads invisibly, shaping the way entire societies process loss. Popular media carries it too. Films and novels often echo themes of sacrifice, redemption through death, or heroes finding glory only when they lay down their lives. While these can be moving stories, they also reinforce the idea that death gives life meaning. That message doesn't arise in a vacuum. It comes from centuries of cultural conditioning under a system that placed death at the center. This cultural saturation makes it harder to step back and recognize what's happening. If everything around you, from the art on museum walls to the songs you hear at weddings and funerals, normalizes death as holy, then questioning it feels unnatural. That's how a framework survives for centuries, not just by preaching from pulpits, but by embedding itself in the symbols, language, and stories people encounter every day. And it's not just about death itself, it's about how life is valued. When a culture is taught that life here is secondary, it naturally undervalues joy, pleasure, and progress. Creativity becomes suspect if it doesn't serve higher ends. Ambition is framed as dangerous pride. Even love is sometimes treated as competition with devotion to God. The death cult logic bleeds into how people experience the most basic human emotions, constantly reminding them that nothing here really matters as much as what comes after. This creates a quiet tension in people's lives. On one hand, they are told to value their families, communities, and work. On the other, they're reminded that all of it is temporary, that their true loyalty lies elsewhere. That split makes it difficult to fully embrace life, to invest without reservation, to find meaning in the here and now. There's always a shadow of doubt, always a whisper that says, "Don't hold on too tightly. This world isn't your home." And the shadow follows people even when they leave the faith. Former believers often describe how funerals feel strange, how holidays feel hollow, how the language of death still haunts their thoughts. Even without active belief, the conditioning lingers. It's the residue of a system that framed life and death in stark terms from the very beginning. This is why it's important to call it what it is. Not because the label itself changes reality, but because seeing the structure clearly is the first step in breaking free of it. A death cult works by making its logic invisible, by wrapping its fixation in beauty, ritual, and tradition. Once you strip away the layers, the pattern is impossible to miss. At the heart of it, the most revealing mark of a death cult is how it changes the way people see themselves. Christianity doesn't just talk about death, it builds identity around it. You're told that you're born broken, that your life belongs to someone, else that your ultimate purpose isn't to live fully, but to prepare to die. That shapes every relationship you have, with yourself, with others, with the world around you. It's why so many people raised in it struggle with guilt, even in moments of joy. It's why ambition, sexuality, and pleasure are often shadowed by shame. The message, repeated endlessly, is that your true reward isn't in this world, so don't get too comfortable here. That subtle voice runs under everything, reminding you that this life is not the point. That whisper lingers even after belief fades, like a song you can't stop hearing. It affects time itself. Instead of seeing life as a brief and precious window to be filled with meaning, believers are trained to see it as a waiting room. Days are measured against eternity. Loss is softened by the promise of reunion, but also cheapened by the dismissal of this life's finality. The result is a paradox, where time both matters desperately, because judgment looms, and doesn't matter at all, because eternity dwarfs it. That contradiction is disorienting, but effective for control. And perhaps the most sobering part is that this isn't hidden. It's not a secret teaching. It's out in the open, celebrated every week. The cross on the wall, the hymns about blood, the sermons about sacrifice, the prayers about death and eternity. All of it is right there, normalized to the point of invisibility. That's how powerful the system is. When the marks of a death cult are worn proudly, and yet no one calls them by name. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. The patterns line up too perfectly. The obsession with death and sacrifice, the glorification of suffering, the promise of reward beyond the grave, the fear of eternal punishment to keep doubters in line, the isolation from outsiders, the suppression of natural instincts, the rituals that reframe horror as holy. Every single box is checked, and if you were raised in it, this realization can feel heavy. It can feel like waking from a dream and realizing that so much of what shaped you was built on celebrating the very thing you once feared most. But it can also be freeing, because once the structure is visible, it loses its invisible power. Once you see the logic for what it is, you can begin to reclaim your life, your body, your time, your joy. You only get one life, not a waiting room, not a test, not a rehearsal. This is it. And far from being meaningless, that reality makes every moment more valuable. Every relationship, every act of kindness, every joy, every discovery, every struggle, they all matter because they happen here, and they only happen once. That's not something to mourn. That's something to cherish. Christianity grew into one of the most powerful systems in history because it convinced people to embrace death as the path to meaning. But when you step outside of it, when you peel back the layers, the truth is simpler. Life doesn't need death to have value. It never did. And the sooner we see that, the sooner we can stop glorifying suffering and start truly living.